So let me move to another topic to what'll finish off this session, and that is the shiny new things we call digital technology. And Andy hit it right on the head. What are we looking for? What do we think it's going to do? Why is it going to be better? And this presentation is going to be a bit of a teaser to see what industry is thinking and what they're doing, and what do we think? What do we think as surgeons? It's certainly going to change as we get more data, and the growth of information is going to be exponential because, of course, AI is part of this. I have a number of conflicts here. I'm not really going to talk about any particular devices or anything else. Technology I'll talk about a bit, and I'll identify where I have a conflict. So it was Charlie Neer, who's on the left, who said shoulder arthroplasty gives good pain relief and function with durable results in thoughtful, capable hands. And he had no technology like we have now. If you look at these two leaders in shoulder arthroplasty, and you could do this in any area of specialization, and you'll have disagreements. One of them on the left is Gilles Walsh, who says, I believe in planning. And the other one on the right is Mark Frankel, and he never plans. And so the question is, what's the evidence and what's the eminence? And much of what we use as our justification is listening to experts and their eminence or their opinions rather than the evidence that's actually provided. And Andy pointed out the value of a registry in another country can be very, very important in terms of what we can report. Rick Mattson, who was mentioned previously, is one of the founders of the American Shoulder Elbow Surgeons. And, he wrote an article entitled What I've Learned Over My Career. And what's interesting is he's a little bit comes across as an anti-technology person. He thinks that computed CT scans are rarely necessary, and it's not really necessary to correct the deformities that we spend so much time thinking about. As opposed to this, Christian Gerver believes in planning, even when it was two-dimensional, like you see in this X-ray, and he said the result is never better than the plan, which is actually true. Codman, my opinion is, Codman would have wanted digital tools because Codman always wanted to see if something was better that would work. And Gerber always said, do the operation in your mind before you do it in the patient. And this cartoon here that some of you may have seen is the reason why Codman was asked to leave the Mass General. Shows an ostrich kicking out golden eggs to the physicians with his head buried in the sand, which is a lot of what we see nowadays when we incentivize volume over real value. Now, again, the concept of value and the value equation you've already seen. It's over time in terms of the amount of money. But the key is, with these new technologies, how is this managed in terms of the cost that we're now applying to the episode of care, which Andy was so clear on in terms of the implant. Now we have a new approach here, and I'm going to share with you what industry thinks about this, and surgeons really aren't thinking about it much. So, what does industry want? What do surgeons want? And what do the patients want? And the patients are somewhat agnostic, although you're going to see, direct consumer driven thinking because people will see things on the internet and then come wanting certain things. So if we look at the kind of what Susan said before, which is going from what you really want to achieve and working backwards, we'd like shorter learning curves with fewer complications. We'd like reduced errors in the planning before we go to surgery that result in wrong surgery and a wrong plan. It actually would be great if we could reduce errors in surgical execution by engineering error avoidance. And some of that's already available in other parts of the body in terms of robotics, and improving the constructs for better biomechanics that result in more durability. And Andy showed you some examples of this, because when we look at an episode of care that's very short, just the episode of the day of surgery, we're not talking about what the patient captures over time. And what's fascinating is the surgeon in the hospital have a 90-day global payment period, after which all the rest of the value, technically speaking, is captured by the patient alone. So if it costs us more for our episode or our part of it than what the patient gets in terms of durability, what is the ethics of that in terms of paying more to give the patient a longer, more durable outcome? And then, of course, the patient experience. So this is what I'm talking about. If you look at the patient's perception of their outcome and process of recovery, here's the early episode of care, and Andy had measured some of this, and for sure the cost of the implant is important. But the rest of this, the durability, is captured by the patient. And these are just different curves for recovery from the patient point of view, their subjective shoulder value over time. Now, I want to share with you some interesting data. This is from the Orthopedic Industry Annual Report from a consulting group called OrthoWorld that I'm told is pretty valid. And I want to share with you the overall spend in orthopedics. First of all, the global spend in orthopedic sales in 2023 was over $57 billion with a percent growth year over year from the last year of 3.5%. Now, what of that is relevant to us? What I'm talking about here now. If you break this down into the orthopedic product segments, you can see the joint replacement drives most of the cost. But extremities is about almost not quite $3 billion, of which probably half of that or so is shoulder arthroplasty. What's interesting is if you look at enabling technology, what I'm going to talk about here, and enabling technology is, you guessed it, surgical planning, robotics, navigation, patient monitoring, etc. That's only 2.1% of the global spend, and it's growing a little bit faster than the overall growth rate of the market itself, but not as fast as you would imagine. So if we now consider this from the standpoint of a digital episode of care, looking at this technology, and in white is what we usually would do, that is eyeballing or 2D qualitative assessment, generic guides, this kind of standard operating procedures, you can see the different kinds of technologies that may be available now and coming in the future. And frankly, we're also missing the possibility of bending the learning curve with simulation in advance of doing the surgery to increase the skill set and reduce the errors that surgeons would otherwise make. But to be fair, that's not, as you'll see in a moment, a big value for industry. So when we look at things like immersive virtual reality, disrupting surgical education, it was actually William Mayo who said there's no excuse today for the surgeon to learn on the patient, and yet look at that operating room. That's how people would learn. And frankly, there are a number of companies trying to survive here creating this. And it's been tough sledding for all of them, frankly, because as I'll show you in a moment, industry and the exact formula for how this is scaled isn't worked out. If you look here, you realize that virtually every company has some kind of virtual planning tool. Well, what do surgeons think about this and what does industry think about it and how is it sustainable in the future? Well, we have articles that show indirect benefit. For example, patient-specific planning actually has the greatest impact in surgical decision-making on low-volume surgeons. And those are individuals who do less surgery than others. And frankly, the more they do this, the more they make decisions like high-volume surgeons, which you would think would be good for the patient. Joe Ionati, who's a leader in this area, demonstrated that we reduce outliers when we place components in a more optimum position using patient-specific planning and guides. And you can see the scatter plot here that's quite different than what you do if you did it with your eyeball. And navigation is a popular thing that's being used now, but to what degree is that changing the outcomes and the durability? We don't know yet about that. So there are a lot of initials here: augmented reality, mixed reality. What are these? Augmented reality is augmenting the real world with referencing, like you see here with intravenous placement. And virtual reality is bringing the virtual world into the real world and using it as an adjunct or tool to navigate. Robots are coming. Well, actually, robots are here, and in the shoulder are coming in the next several years, one coming this year and some next year. And, you know, this has a total different business model than some of the other tools. But what's really interesting is that all of these major players in this area are already collaborating with orthopedic industry and many other industries for that matter in scaling these technologies. And frankly, this has been called the fourth revolution, particularly when you talk about artificial intelligence. And I'll talk on prioritization here in a moment. So it was Steve Jobs who said everyone here has a sense that right now is one of those moments when we're influencing the future. But what does industry think and what do surgeons think right now? And how is that going to change? And that will be largely driven by how successful the industry is in terms of its revenue model and its responsibility to return a value to shareholders and the adoption of surgeons. So what I did, which I haven't presented yet, this is the first time I'm presenting this, is I did a surgeon survey that looked at not quite 200 surgeons across the European and American specialty for shoulder, and also the Codman Society. And then I did a blinded questionnaire or survey for 9 industry players in this area, of which 6 responded. Three did not, and that's, of course, not surprising. I don't know which of the industry players actually responded. I have kind of an idea, but not for sure. So I'm going to show you first what do surgeons think. If you look at these surgeons, the different colors are the different societies, with the American Society being in red and the European Society in green. And you can see most individuals who are members of these organizations define themselves as shoulder surgeons, although we have others as well. If you look at how many years in practice, it's a pretty broad experience across the board, although most by a fair bit have been in practice more than 20 years. If you look what percentage of their practice is shoulder arthroplasty, because of course we do other things, it's kind of between 10 and 50%. And if you look at how many shoulder placements that most do per year, then it certainly favors the high volume, where most indicate that they do more than 40 per year. That's a very important threshold in terms of complications, and that's work that Avant-Garde and our research group have done from the Codman Society, demonstrating that this is directly correlated to revision surgery. We asked people, do you do preoperative planning? And of course, in this expert group, the vast majority do, but there's some real confusion about what they think they're doing and what they're actually doing, as I'll show you in a moment. Do you use preoperative digital tools? And the answer is yes for most of them. And then if you use tools, what are you using? So what's fascinating is if you look here, they say, well, virtual reality, that's the smaller group. Many people say I do other things. Well, the problem is, and this is sort of each of these words reflects the number of answers for what they use. You can see the larger print is what they use mostly, which really belongs in the virtual planning category, even though they put it in the other category. So I think they're confused about what that is. And you can see some of the other planning tools that are used from different companies as well. So most do virtual planning, but don't really understand what the hell it is. Do you use any of the following digital technology to execute your plan in the operating room? So what kind of tools do we use at all here? And what's fascinating is that most surgeons are really using a single disposable item, which is some kind of a patient-specific guide, or in some instances, guides that are reusable, rather than digital tools. The guides are created from the digital planning, and those are the ones that people are mostly using, but we haven't yet replaced them with things like navigation and robotics, etc. Will that happen? Is yet to be determined. What is your expectation now of how the technology will help you in the future? And the overwhelming winner here is AI. And, if you look here for the other category, people have different ideas about how AI is going to help them, but nobody knows for sure. And you can see that following this is navigation and augmented reality and other things that I think, frankly, people are largely confused about. And what would you like to see coming from industry is an important one that industry would want to know. And overwhelmingly, it's artificial intelligence and machine learning, though, again, there's some confusion here in terms of what that is. And that's followed by improved VR planning and navigation, etc. Okay. Do you think there's a need for post-operative management tools in digital, in terms of digital tools that can be used? And what's interesting here is that's significantly the case, with upwards of 70% of physicians wanting that. Yet, as I'll show you, that's not really a priority of industry. And frankly, if you ask them, what do you want to have in the post-operative period in managing patients, the number one is some kind of a post-operative recovery app-based approach. And then you have all these other things like wearables and digital analysis of range of motion and et cetera, which yet to have to be sorted out by what industry might provide and what surgeons might want. So if we look now at the companies and ask them these questions, here's question number one. What are your company's priorities for development and application of digital healthcare in shoulder arthroplasty? And again, you can see there's alignment. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is number one, followed by navigation and then mixed reality and et cetera. If you follow that along and then you say, well, how do you think that this will create value? Then understandably, industry believes this will reduce errors, and I think surgeons probably believe that as well, but we have yet to document that that's the case. Will it change and move the less experienced surgeons into the category of more experienced surgeons with less complications and less reoperations? And the second value point is going to be creating data and further information that informs best practices in decision making, potentially predicting what happens if you do one thing versus another thing. Improved efficiency, et cetera, are other options. And when you try to get answers from industry, in particular, I took a few comments from each of them. They're rather kind of non-specific comments about under-evaluation or preoperative planning with AI or whatever. It's not really that focused. And frankly, I thought for a minute, I better ask industry what their priorities are in terms of who they're focusing on. And this might surprise you a bit to see that shareholders are at the bottom of the list. And you should at least take note of the fact, the surgeons that remain on this call, that you're actually the highest priority, coming slightly above patients, largely because patients require you to tell them the value of the technology. And then actually the one that may be paying for this, which Andy pointed out, is a hospital. And there seem to be less focus because perhaps the surgeons and the patients will drive this. It's not entirely clear yet. So this is really interesting. When you ask them about the revenue model for artificial intelligence, virtually everybody else says other. And this includes under-evaluation, unknown at present, et cetera. And so one of the concerns I have is, how will AI scale when there's no clear revenue model for it in the world of episode of care that we're currently living in? And my feeling is it's going to be an indirect model from the standpoint of being the stickiness to the products that are used. That remains to be seen, but it's something that these companies are going to grapple with because they're making significant sunk costs into developing AI. So I would submit to you the future is loading from the standpoint of how we improve on the durable outcomes for our patients. And we hope that this will be the case with digital technology, but we don't know for sure. And this talk is going to change significantly in the coming few years. Thank you.